The knock came at 2:14 a.m. on December 7, 1946. 3 short raps, 3 long, 3 short. SOS. My blood froze because I knew that pattern. Jack had taught it to me on our honeymoon in 1938, saying that if he ever needed to signal me in an emergency, that's how I'd know it was truly him. Except Jack had been dead for 5 years. I buried him myself after Pearl Harbor. Or, at least, I buried his dress uniform and his father's pocket watch in an empty coffin the Navy gave me. I'm Rose Cooper, 32 years old, standing in my nightgown in a small house in Pearl City, gripping Jack's old baseball bat like my life depends on it. Dead men don't knock on doors at 2:14 in the morning, especially not at the exact minute the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor 5 years ago. I know because I've been awake at this time every December 7th since 1941, sitting in my kitchen, drinking coffee that tastes like regret. But there it was again. 3 short, 3 long, 3 short. Before I go on, you need to understand this. That day wasn't just etched into America's memory, it burned itself into my family's life forever. These are my memories. And if this story speaks to you, please let me know in the comments. Now, let me tell you about the night my dead husband came home. The smell hit me first. Lucky Strike cigarettes seeping through the crack under the door. Jack's brand. Nobody else on our street smoked Lucky Strikes. My neighbor, Mrs. Yamamoto, before they took her away to those camps, used to joke that she could always tell when Jack was home from 3 houses away. My hand trembled as I reached for the doorknob. It was already turning from the other side. I'd kept everything exactly as Jack had left it. His coffee mug still sat unwashed on the kitchen counter, 5 years of dust coating the rim where his lips had last touched. His navy wings were still pins to the curtains in our bedroom where he'd left them the night before the attack, saying they looked crooked on his uniform. I wore my wedding ring on my right hand now, beside the widow's band I added in 1942. And there I was, about to face whatever was turning my doorknob at 2:14 a.m. The door opened an inch, then another. In that narrow gap, I saw an eye, just one, that looked exactly like Jack's, except it was surrounded by scars, as if someone had tried to erase him from existence. December 7th, 1941 started like every Sunday in paradise. I was making Spam and Eggs, the Hawaiian breakfast special Jack loved, even though he was from Ohio and claimed Spam wasn't real food until he tried it fried with pineapple. He was supposed to work that morning fixing engines on planes at Hickam Field. Just another Navy mechanic, he'd said. Nothing dangerous about turning wrenches. He kissed me goodbye at 6:30. He tasted like coffee and promises. Said he'd be home by lunch and maybe we'd go to the beach. The first explosion hit at 7:59. I thought it was construction. They were always building something at Pearl Harbor. Then the second blast rattled our windows, and Mrs. Yamamoto ran out of her house screaming in Japanese. The church bells calling people to early service suddenly stopped, cut off mid-ring. Then came the planes. So many planes, with big red circles on their wings that looked like angry suns. I ran toward the harbor with dozens of other wives, our church dresses flapping, our Sunday heels clicking on pavement suddenly covered in ash. The MPs stopped us at the gate, young boys with rifles who looked more terrified than we were. Behind them, the USS Arizona was splitting in half, fire shooting 300 feet into the air. The Oklahoma was rolling over like a dying whale. And somewhere in that chaos was Jack, who was supposed to be safe in a hangar fixing engines, not flying, never flying. We waited on the lawn outside the base for 48 hours. Nobody told us anything official, but sailors would sneak over and whisper names. Who'd they seen alive? Who'd they seen floating? Some women got miracles, their men walking out, covered in oil but breathing. Others were told to go home and wait for telegrams. I got nothing. Jack had simply vanished into the smoke. The telegram came 2 weeks later. We regret to inform you that aviation mechanics mate first class Jack Cooper is missing. presumed dead. Missing. Presumed dead. Like the Navy had misplaced him. Like we might turn up between the couch cushions if we looked hard enough. I laughed until I cried, then cried until I couldn't breathe. The Navy could lose a battleship in a bathtub and still call it presumed. My mother flew in from California, took one look at me, and said, "Well, at least you're young enough to start over." I wanted to throw her out, but I needed someone to help me figure out how to bury a man who wasn't there. Because that's what the Navy wanted me to do. Have a service, get closure, move on. They were very efficient about their presumptions. We buried Jack's dress uniform on February 15th, 1942, 2 months and 8 days after Pearl Harbor, on what would have been our 4th anniversary. The coffin weighed almost nothing, just his uniform, his father's pocket watch, and a photograph from our wedding, where both of us looked impossibly young and stupid with happiness. The chaplain spoke of sacrifice and duty. I wanted to scream that Jack's duty was to come home, but I just stood there in my navy blue dress. I refused to wear black and threw dirt on an empty box. The other wives understood. We formed a little club, meeting every Wednesday at the Methodist Church. We called ourselves the Presumedly Dead Club, and laughed at things that would horrify normal people, like how Margaret's husband Tom had been presumed dead for 3 months before walking out of the jungle in the Philippines, 30 pounds lighter, but alive. Or how Betty's husband sent her a postcard from a Japanese prison camp that said, "Weather is here. Wish you were beautiful." Their old honeymoon joke. The presumedly dead had the way of becoming presumedly wrong. So I did what every woman in Pearl Harbor did. I went to work, got a job as a riveter at the shipyard, building new ships to replace the ones still leaking oil in the harbor. We built them faster than they could sink them. Our supervisor used to say there was this tiny Filipino woman named Gloria who could out-rivet any man on the line. 8 hours a day, I drove hot metal into steel plates and pretended each rivet was holding Jack together somewhere out there. I wrote him letters every Sunday, silly letters about how the Victory Garden was growing, how his brother had enlisted, how I'd finally figured out his mother's cornbread recipe. I put them all in his old cigar box, the one he'd bought in Cuba before we met. By 1943, I needed a second box. By 1944, a third. I told myself I was writing them for when he came back, so he could catch up on everything he'd missed. Really, I was writing them because stopping felt like admitting he was gone. The strange reports started in 1943, men presumed dead walking out of Japanese camps. A pilot from the Arizona turned up in Australia, living with Aborigines who'd found him washed ashore. Every story gave me hope and broke me a little more, because none of them were Jack. I checked every list the Red Cross published, called the Navy so many times they finally assigned me a special liaison officer whose only job was to say, "No, Mrs. Cooper." Still, no word. By 1945, even I was getting tired of hoping. When Germany surrendered in May, everyone celebrated, but I felt empty. And when we dropped the atomic bombs in August and Japan surrendered, I didn't feel relief, just silence. I stood in the street watching everyone celebrate and felt like a ghost at my own funeral. The war was over. The men who were coming home were coming home. The ones who weren't. On December 7th, 1945, the 4th anniversary of Pearl Harbor, I finally took off my wedding ring and moved it to my right hand. I added a simple gold band on my left ring finger, my widow's ring. My mother had been trying to set me up with Mr. Harrison from the bank for 2 years. He was kind, stable, had all his limbs, and had never been presumed anything. I finally said yes to dinner. We set it for December 14th, 1 week away. I figured 7 days was enough time to practice being someone new. The years between 1943 and 1946 taught me how to be professionally alone. I'd been promoted to shift supervisor at the shipyard, bought war bonds with every paycheck, and learned to dance with other women's husbands at the USO dances without it meaning anything. I could make a joke about being a widow that made people laugh instead of look away. I'm like a library book, checked out but never returned. The house stayed exactly as Jack had left it. His lucky shirt still hung on the bathroom door, his coffee mug gathered dust on the counter. I told myself I was too busy to pack things away, but really I was living in a museum of a marriage, curator of artifacts from a life that had stopped existing at 7:55 a.m. on a Sunday morning. My mother visited every month from California, each time with a new strategy to fix me. First it was, you need to redecorate. I didn't. Then, you need to take a trip. I couldn't leave. Finally, you need to remarry. I wanted to scream. She'd bring newspaper clippings about other war widows who'd found love again, as if they were instruction manuals for rebuilding a life. Rose, honey, you're 32, not dead. I wanted to tell her that parts of me were, but that felt melodramatic, even for me. The other, presumably dead wives were my salvation. There was Margaret, whose husband had actually returned from the Philippines, but was so shell-shocked he might as well have stayed missing. Betty, whose husband was confirmed alive in a POW camp, but hadn't written in 2 years. And me, the one who buried an empty coffin and kept writing letters to a ghost. We'd meet for coffee and lie about being fine, then laugh about the lies. It was cheaper than therapy and came with better cake. Mr. Harrison started coming around in late 1945. He was persistent in that mild-mannered banker way, like compound interest. Barely noticeable at first, but eventually impossible to ignore. He'd stop by with groceries since he was passing by. Nobody passed by my street unless they were lost or looking for me. He'd offer to fix things that weren't broken, mow my lawn when it barely needed it, and bring books he thought I'd like. He was courting me like it was 1885, and I was too tired to tell him to stop. The truth was, by December 1946, I was ready to stop being Jack's widow and start being Rose again. I'd packed one box of his things, just his uniforms, folded with military precision. I'd cleaned his coffee mug, though I'd placed it back in the same spot. I'd even bought a new dress, red with small white flowers, nothing a widow would wear. I was practicing being alive again. Which is why, when that knock came at 2:14 a.m. on December 7th, 1946, my first thought wasn't hope, it was anger. How dare someone play with my grief on this anniversary? How dare them use Jack's signal, smoke his cigarettes, and turn my doorknob in the middle of the night when I was finally ready to let him go? But there he was. Or what was left of him. The man in my doorway weighed maybe 90 pounds. The left side of his face was melted like candle wax. One eye was missing, the socket covered with scar tissue that looked like pink spiderwebs. His hands were wrong, fingers bent at angles that made my stomach twist. But his right eye, the one that had survived whatever hell he'd been through, was Jack's exact shade of green, like sea glass after a storm. "Rosie," he whispered. His voice sounded like gravel being crushed. "I know I look different, but..." He tried to smile, and only half his face cooperated. "Pineapples still don't belong on ham." I dropped the baseball bat. Nobody knew that phrase except Jack. It was our code from our honeymoon in Honolulu, when the hotel had served us ham with pineapple, and Jack declared it an abomination against Ohio cuisine. We'd laughed so hard the other guests stared. After that, whenever we needed to prove something was real between us, one of us would say it. "Jack," my voice came out small, like a child's. "But I buried you. There was a service. The Navy says a lot of things." He leaned against the doorframe like it was the only thing keeping him upright. "Can I come in, Rosie? I've been traveling for 3 months to get here, and I need to sit down." I helped him to the kitchen. His body felt weightless against mine. He smelled wrong, like hospitals, ship fuel, and something medicinal that burned my nose. But beneath it, barely there, was Jack's smell. Lucky Strikes and the bay rum aftershave he'd always used. He collapsed into his old chair, the one I'd never let anyone else sit in, and looked at his coffee mug on the counter. "You kept it," he said, and then he started crying. Not movie tears, real, body-shaking sobs that sounded like they were tearing him apart from the inside. 5 years, and you kept my damn coffee mug? I wanted to comfort him, but I was afraid that if I touched him, he'd vanish like smoke. So I did what I always did when I didn't know what to do. I made coffee. Real coffee, not the chicory stuff we drank during rationing. My hands shook as I measured the grounds, and I could feel him watching me with that one good eye. "They told me you remarried," he said finally. "A Red Cross nurse in Manila said they'd checked, that you'd moved on. I almost didn't come. I wore your dog tags every day for 4 years. I wrote you 312 letters. I named a star after you, the one right above Diamond Head, the one you said looked like it was winking. How's that for moving on?" He laughed, or tried to. It came out like a rusty gate creaking open. "Still my Rosie," he said softly. "Still fighting even when there's no fight to win." I turned around and forced myself to look at him. Really look at him. The burns covered most of his left side. His fingers had been broken and healed wrong, each one pointing in a slightly different direction, as if they couldn't agree on anything. He was missing teeth. Scars circled his neck like someone had tried to hang him more than once. But his smile, crooked as it was, still tilted higher on the right side, just like it always had when he was trying not to laugh at his own jokes. "Where the hell have you been, Jack Cooper? And don't you dare say presume dead." Jack's story came out in pieces, like shrapnel working its way to the surface. He'd been at Hickam Field when the attack began, exactly where he was supposed to be. But when the Zeros started strafing the mechanics, a pilot with half his face blown off grabbed Jack, shoved him into a P-40 Warhawk, and screamed at him to fly it out before the Japanese destroyed every plane on the ground. Jack had never flown a combat aircraft in his life, only crop dusters back in Ohio, but he got it airborne. I made it about 3 miles before they shot me down, crashed in a sugarcane field. Some Japanese soldiers found me first, decided I was too interesting to kill. He explained that he'd been carrying technical manuals in his flight suit, schematics he'd grabbed from the hangar. The soldiers assumed anyone with those must be important. The Japanese shipped him to a place that didn't officially exist, a camp in occupied China where they kept prisoners they didn't want the Red Cross to know about. 12 Americans were there, all with technical skills: aircraft mechanics, radar operators, a submarine engineer, men who could be tortured for information or forced to work on Japanese equipment. They made us fix their Zeros, the same planes that killed our friends. And if we refused, he held up his twisted fingers. They had creative ways of encouraging cooperation. But Jack and the others found ways to fight back. They repaired the planes, but sabotaged them in ways invisible until combat. A fuel line that ruptured under pressure, an altimeter that failed above 10,000 feet, bolts that sheared off during hard turns. It took the Japanese 2 years to figure it out. When they did, they executed 3 of the Americans and tortured the rest for a month straight. "That's when I lost the eye," he said, touching the scarred socket and most of the skin on my left side. "They loved making examples, but they couldn't kill us all. They needed us to keep their planes flying, so they just made us wish we were dead." The camp wasn't on any Red Cross list. Officially, those 12 Americans didn't exist. When other POW camps were liberated in 1945, theirs wasn't even inspected. It wasn't until the Soviets pushed into Manchuria in the final days of the war that they were found, by accident, when Russian troops were searching for a fuel depot. The Soviets didn't know what to do with us. We had no records, no dog tags. The Japanese destroyed everything. We looked like walking corpses. They thought we might be spies, deserters, or just insane. It took 3 months just to convince them we were American. Then came the bureaucracy. The U.S. military didn't want to admit they'd left men behind. The State Department didn't want an incident with the Soviets. For 6 months, Jack and the 8 remaining survivors sat in a hospital in Vladivostok while governments argued over who they were and what to do with them. Meanwhile, their families had already grieved, already buried empty coffins, already moved on. When they finally sent us to Manila, they gave us a choice: take a medical discharge, a pension, and sign papers saying we wouldn't talk about where we'd been, or spend years fighting to prove who we were. Most of the men took the deal, but Jack had to come home. The first week felt like living with a ghost who looked like my husband's broken shadow. Jack couldn't sleep in our bed. Too soft. After years on concrete floors, he curled up on the kitchen floor with one of his old Navy blankets, and I'd find him there each morning, shaking from nightmares he couldn't describe. He couldn't eat rice, couldn't even smell it without vomiting. The sound of planes overhead sent him diving under tables. I'll be honest, ladies, if you could like this video and subscribe to the channel, it would mean everything. This story deserves to be heard, and your support makes that possible. Thank you. The Navy wanted to debrief Jack for weeks, but he could only handle an hour at a time before the shaking began. They brought admirals who wanted details about sabotage, engineers curious about Japanese modifications, and psychiatrists studying what they called combat fatigue, what we now know as PTSD. Jack told them all to go to hell, except with words that would have made a sailor blush. But slowly, in small ways, he began coming back to me. The first time he truly laughed was 3 weeks later at a Bugs Bunny cartoon in the theater. Something about Elmer Fudd blowing himself up struck him as hysterical. He laughed until he cried, then cried until he laughed again. The teenage usher looked terrified, but I just held Jack's mangled hand and let him feel whatever he needed to feel. We had to relearn how to be married. The first time we tried to kiss, I turned the wrong way, expecting his face to be whole. The first time he tried to hold me, his broken fingers couldn't grip properly. We were like teenagers, fumbling, awkward, except we were in our 30s and carrying wounds you couldn't see. But we kept trying, because what else was there to do? We'd already survived the impossible. The other wives from the presumed dead club became my lifeline. When Margaret's husband Tom met Jack, they simply nodded, like members of the world's worst fraternity.
Betty's husband was still in a camp in Japan, but she brought over casseroles and never asked questions when Jack had to eat outside because the kitchen felt too closed in. These women understood that sometimes love meant sitting in silence while your husband stared at nothing, seeing ghosts you'd never recognize. Jack couldn't work on planes anymore. His hands were too damaged, and the sound of engines made him tremble. So he started teaching math at the local high school. The kids called him Captain Hook because of his bent fingers, but they said it with affection. He was good at it, patient with struggling students, because he knew what it meant to fight for every small victory. He'd come home covered in chalk dust instead of engine grease, and slowly he began smiling again. The hardest part was the guilt. "You buried me," he'd say sometimes, staring into nothing. "You had a funeral, you grieved, and then I came back and ruined it all." "You didn't ruin anything," I'd tell him. "You survived. That's not ruin, that's a miracle. But you were ready to move on." "That banker," I said firmly, "is a nice man who will make some nice woman a nice husband, but he's not you. He's never been you. Even when you were dead, he wasn't you." We decided to get married again on December 7th, 1947, not because the first marriage wasn't valid, but because we weren't the same people who'd stood at that altar in 1938. The Jack and Rose we had been were gone, casualties of war, just as surely as if they'd been hit by bombs. These new people, scarred, strange, and somehow still in love, deserved their own beginning. The ceremony took place at the USS Arizona Memorial, just a simple platform back then, nothing like the grand monument it would become. We wanted to honor the men who never came home, who never got to knock on doors at 2:14 a.m. and scare their wives with resurrections. 1,177 men were still entombed in the Arizona's hull, and we stood above them, promising to live the lives they couldn't. Our wedding party consisted of other couples from the war, some who'd never been separated, some who endured years apart, and 3 other couples whose husbands had been presumed dead but turned up alive. We called ourselves the Lazarus Club. And if that sounds like dark humor, well, you didn't survive what we survived.
Betty was my maid of honor. Her husband finally home from Japan, 40 pounds lighter but laughing again. Tom was Jack's best man, and they stood there in ill-fitting suits, Jack's hanging off him like a scarecrow's clothes, both grinning like they'd outsmarted death itself. Jack's vows broke me. Rose Cooper, I knocked on death's door for 5 years just so I could knock on yours again. Every day they tried to break me, I thought about your coffee, your terrible singing in the shower, and the way you steal all the blankets. You kept my coffee mug for 5 years. I kept your memory. Now let's see what we can keep together. My vows were simpler. Jack Cooper, I buried you once. I'm never doing that again. Not even if the entire United States Navy personally insists you're dead. Not even if they bring me your body. I'll assume you're just running late until proven otherwise by God himself. And even then, I'll want a second opinion. The chaplain, the same man who had performed Jack's funeral, had tears streaming down his face. Later he told us it was the first time he'd ever been able to un-eulogize someone, and he hoped it would be the last, because his heart couldn't take it again. But here's what truly broke me. After the ceremony, Jack pulled out a packet of letters, 47 of them, tied with the same ribbon I'd used years ago. Every letter I'd written him in 1942, the first year after his death. Somehow the Red Cross had been delivering mail to his camp, even though it didn't officially exist. The Japanese had kept them and used them as tools of torture, reading them aloud while they beat him. But one guard, who'd lost his own son in the war, secretly saved them and gave them to Jack when the Soviets liberated the camp. I read every one of them in the hospital in Vladivostok. That's how I knew you'd kept the coffee mug. That's how I knew you named a star. That's how I knew to come home. 6 months after our second wedding, I became pregnant. Jack was terrified. His body was so damaged he was sure something would be wrong. But on September 2nd, 1948, the 3rd anniversary of VJ Day, our daughter was born, perfect, screaming, and alive. We named her Victoria, but called her Hope. Because what else do you name a child who shouldn't exist, born to a father who should be dead and a mother who should be a widow? Jack lived until 1987, 40 more years after he knocked on my door. We had 3 more children, 7 grandchildren, and a life nothing like what we'd planned in 1938, but exactly what we needed. He never stopped having nightmares. I never stopped being grateful for them, because nightmares meant he was alive to dream them. Some people say Pearl Harbor ended when Japan surrendered. Others say it ended when the memorial was built. For me, Pearl Harbor ended at 2:14 a.m. on December 7th, 1946, when my dead husband knocked on my door. That was the moment the war finally released us, the moment we stopped being casualties and became survivors. Every December 7th after that, at 2:14 a.m., Jack would knock on our bedroom door. 3 short, 3 long, 3 short. And I would get up, no matter how old we grew, no matter how tired. I'd open the door and say, "You're late, sailor." And he would smile and answer, "But I'm here." Because that was all that mattered. Not the 5 years of hell, not the scars or the nightmares or the twisted fingers or the missing eye, just the knock on the door and the person brave enough to answer it. He was there. We were there. Against all odds, against the Imperial Japanese Navy, against U.S. bureaucracy, and against death itself, we were there. And that, my friends, is how you come back from the dead. You just keep knocking until someone you love opens the door.